In the summer of 1992, in a green fold of farmland in western Pennsylvania, 14 people gathered on a Saturday for a family reunion. There was potato salad in a yellow bowl. There was a radio in a kitchen window. By Sunday morning, every one of them was gone. So were 3 cars. The house stood open and untouched. The cake half cut on the counter, the screen door swinging in the wind. Police found no blood, no struggle, no tire marks, no bodies. Within 4 months, the case quietly went cold. 24 years later, one small detail reopened it, not a detail anyone had been looking for, and not the one everybody had built their lives around. What that detail finally uncovered was a truth no one was prepared for. Because for 24 years, this town had been searching in the wrong direction. Not the wrong road, the wrong direction entirely. If stories like this matter to you, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling them. Now, let's get into today's case. The Doyle farm sat at the end of Pinch Road, 3 miles outside Kettner's Bend, in Sable Township, Vesey County. It was not a big farm, and it had not been a working farm since the late 70s. Walter Doyle had let the dairy go when his knees went. What was left was 61 acres of pasture, a red barn with a sunken roofline, a farmhouse painted the color of butter, and a pond down in the low field where his grandchildren swam every summer of their lives. Walter was 74 that year. He wore the same brown cardigan from March to November and kept a pocket knife he used for everything: apples, twine, splinters, fingernails. His wife Eileen was 71, small and quick, and she had a habit of touching the back of your neck when she passed behind your chair. Everybody who ever sat at her table remembers that. The little press of a warm hand, and then she was gone into the kitchen again. They had 5 children. 4 of them came home that weekend. Raymond, 44, drove up from Uniontown with his wife Bonnie and their 2 kids, Curtis, 16, who had just gotten his license and would not shut up about it, and Amy, 13, who had brought a Walkman and a look of pure suffering. Loretta, 46, came with her husband, Frank Kesh, and their son Tommy, who was 11 and obsessed with a plastic bug-catching jar. Gil, 39, the youngest son, came with his wife Denise and their 2 Pete, 9, and Junie, 6. And Eileen's older sister Hazel came, 77, with her walker and her enormous purse and a Tupperware of pickled beets nobody was going to eat. 14 people, 3 cars, one long Saturday in June. The 5th Doyle child was a man named Wendell, and Wendell did not come. He was 37 then, working second shift at a tire plant in Connellsville. And he and his father had said things to each other at Christmas that neither of them had taken back. He told his mother on the phone that he had to work. He did not have to work. He sat in his apartment that Saturday and watched a ball game with the sound off. That decision would eat him alive for the next 24 years. Now the person this story actually belongs to was not a Doyle at all. Her name was Marguerite Teal. Everybody called her Margot. In June of 1992, she was 17 years old, with a bad home perm she had done herself, and a summer job bagging groceries at the Foodland in Kettner's Bend. She was not family. She was barely a guest. She came because her Aunt Dot Teal cut Eileen Doyle's hair every 3rd Thursday, and had been invited the way people in small towns get invited to things, which is to say casually and completely. Margot did not want to go. She was 17. She wanted to be anywhere else. She got there at noon, and within 20 minutes, a 6-year-old had attached herself to Margot's leg like a barnacle and refused to be removed. That was Junie Doyle. Junie had a gap where a front tooth used to be and a strawberry-shaped plastic barrette, holding back one side of her hair. She had decided, on no evidence, that Margot was the most interesting person at the reunion. She followed Margot to the food table. She followed her to the porch. She narrated her own life in a constant, unbroken stream about the ducks on the pond, about her brother Pete being a liar, about how she was going to be a veterinarian or possibly a lifeguard. Margot, who had arrived sullen, spent 6 hours being someone's favorite person for the first time in her life. They fed the ducks stale hot dog buns, except there were no ducks. Junie was very upset about this and explained it 4 separate times. The ducks had left because the pond had gone away, because the water went down the hole. Margot did not think about that sentence again for 24 years. The afternoon was ordinary in the way that only a perfect afternoon can be ordinary. Somebody had a boombox on the porch rail playing the country station. The men stood around Raymond's Chevy with the hood up, not fixing anything. Bonnie and Denise laid out the food on a folding table with a yellow and white oilcloth cover, the kind with a soft flannel backing, printed with little bunches of cherries. Hazel held court in a lawn chair. Eileen came behind every single chair at some point and put her hand on the back of somebody's neck. Walter took photographs with a Kodak he had owned since the Ford administration. He used one whole roll before 3 o'clock and made a big production out of loading a second one, holding the film canister up in the light and squinting like a jeweler. Around 4, the sky went white and it rained hard for 20 minutes. And everybody crowded into the kitchen and laughed about it. And then it quit and the whole valley steamed. That was the last good hour. Margot would spend the rest of her life going back over what happened next, and for 24 years she got it wrong. Not because she lied, because she remembered the wrong things, and because everybody around her wanted the wrong things remembered. Here is what she actually noticed, and what she would not be able to say out loud until 2016. Something felt wrong, really wrong. The first thing was the pond. When she walked down to the low field with Junie in the middle of the afternoon, there was no pond. There was a bowl of gray mud 200 feet across with a skin of standing rainwater on top of it. And the cattails around the edge were lying flat and dying. And the old dock Walter had built stood on its 4 legs in the middle of nothing, like a table in an empty room. The mud had cracks in it, wide ones, some of them a hand's width across, running in curves. Junie said it had been like that since Tuesday. She said her grandpa said the pond had a leak. Margot remembers the smell. She has never been able to describe it properly. She says it was like a penny in your mouth. And under that, a rotten egg smell. And under that, something cold, the smell of a cellar or a cave or the inside of a well. It came up out of those cracks in the mud. On a 90-degree day, standing at the edge of that field, the air moving against her bare arms was cold. The second thing was the porch. When Margot went to set down a paper plate on the porch table, the plate slid. Not much, but it slid. She put a bottle cap on the boards and watched it roll south toward the low field. And she thought, huh. And then somebody called her name, and she forgot about it. The third thing was the door. The screen door on the kitchen wouldn't latch anymore. Eileen had a wooden yardstick propped against it. She said the house had settled. She said it like it was nothing, like an old house being crooked is just what old houses do. The fourth thing was the sound. Twice that afternoon, Margot heard something she took for far-off thunder, a low rolling boom that seemed to come from under her shoes rather than from the sky. The second time it happened, she watched the water in the horse trough by the barn shiver in rings. Nobody else reacted. Sable Township had been strip-mined and deep-mined and blasted for 100 years. Ground noise was just ground noise. You stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a highway. And the fifth thing was the birds. Around 6 o'clock, Margot noticed that the swallows that had been diving all afternoon around the barn were gone. All of them. The whole valley had gone quiet in a way she couldn't name. She was 17. She noticed all 5 of these things and filed exactly none of them as important. Because a person is not built to look at a sliding paper plate and a leaking pond and a boom in the ground and assemble them into a warning. Nobody is. The men standing around that Chevy had lived on that hill their whole lives, and they didn't assemble it either. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Around 6:45, Aunt Dot said it was time to go. Junie did not take this well. She grabbed Margot's hand and towed her to the porch steps and, with enormous ceremony, worked the strawberry barrette out of her own hair and pressed it into Margot's palm and closed her fingers over it. She said Margot had to come back next Saturday. She said it like a legal agreement. Margot said okay. She got in her aunt's Buick and looked back once. Walter was hooking the hay wagon to the tractor because he had promised the kids a ride down to the low field and a fire in the fire ring after dark. Curtis was moving the 3 cars off the muddy lane and down onto the flat ground by the old pond, where it was firmer and there was room. Eileen was standing at the kitchen window with her hands in the sink. Junie was on the porch rail, waving with her whole arm, the way small children wave, like they're trying to flag down an airplane. At 6:41 p.m. on Saturday, June 27, 1992, Margot Teal drove down Pinch Road. She was the last person outside that family to see any of them alive. At 7:52 p.m., a seismograph at the Cobb Ridge Station, 41 miles away on the campus of Trenner University, recorded an event of magnitude 2.1. A graduate student cataloged it 3 weeks later as a probable quarry blast and moved on. Nobody put those 2 facts in the same room for 24 years. The mail carrier, a woman named Charlene Voss, came up Pinch Road at 9:10 on Monday morning. Saturday's mail was still in the box. That was unusual, but not alarming. What was alarming was the kitchen door standing wide open with a yardstick fallen across the threshold. Charlene called out. Nobody answered. She stepped inside. The house was immaculate and completely wrong. The cake was on the counter, half of it cut, the knife still lying on the plate with dried icing on the blade. Somebody's reading glasses sat on the kitchen table on top of a folded newspaper. There were 14 coffee cups in the drainer. Hazel's walker was parked beside the good chair in the front room. Every purse in that family was in the house, 5 of them. On the bed in the downstairs bedroom, wallets inside, cash inside. Eileen's wedding ring was in the dish by the sink where she always put it when she washed up. The radio was still on, playing static, because the station had gone off the air at midnight, and nobody had turned the dial. Upstairs, beds were made. Suitcases were unpacked. Toothbrushes in a cup. Outside, there were no cars. Charlene Voss walked out into that yard and stood there and turned in a full circle and did not understand what she was looking at, because everything was right, except that the world was empty. The barn door was latched. The lawn chairs were still in a rough circle. The folding table stood where it had stood, but the oilcloth cover was gone off it. And so were the food and the coolers and the boombox. She got in her mail truck and drove to the fire hall and told them something was very wrong at the Doyle place. The state police arrived at 11:20 a.m. The trooper who caught the case was a corporal named Emmett Lisk. He was 33 years old. He had a jaw that clicked when he chewed and a way of writing in his notebook without looking down at it. He would work this case, in one form or another, for the next 26 years, and it would be the only thing anyone ever asked him about at parties. And he would come to hate it the way you hate a song you loved once. Lisk walked that farm for 11 hours the first day. Here is what he had: 14 missing people ranging in age from 6 to 77, 3 missing vehicles: Raymond's blue-gray Chevy Celebrity, Loretta's brown country Squire wagon, Gil's white Ford pickup. He had a house with no sign of struggle, no forced entry, no blood, and no note. He had a family with no debts worth running from, no criminal ties, no history of anything at all. He had 14 sets of house keys accounted for and 3 sets of car keys missing. He had a hay wagon, hitched and ready, standing empty in the barnyard with the tractor still attached and the tractor's key in the ignition. And he had the low field. The low field was a mess. It had rained Saturday afternoon and again Sunday night, hard. The bottom of that field was a wide, churned, brown dish of mud, standing water in the middle, cracked and heaved at the edges, and no pond in it at all. There were no tire tracks in it because there was nothing that would hold a tire track. It was soup. Lisk wrote in his notebook, "Low field flooded / slumped cattle damage. No usable ground." 14 words. He would read them again, out loud, in a hearing room, 24 years later, and his voice would not be steady. They brought in K9 units on Tuesday. 2 dogs, then 4. Every dog did the same thing. They took scent off the beds in the house. They worked the yard, the barnyard, the lane, and then every one of them went down the slope toward the low field, walked out about 30 feet onto that mud flat, and stopped. They circled. They sat. They looked back at their handlers. One handler, a man named Bo Faraday, told Lisk that the dogs weren't losing the trail. He said it was more like the trail didn't go anywhere. He said it like he was embarrassed. The theory that hardened out of that was simple and wrong. The family had gotten into their 3 cars, driven down the wet lane, and left, or been made to leave. 14 people, 3 vehicles, 1 road out. The alternative, that the scent ended at the mud because the people were in the mud, did occur to somebody. On the Thursday, a crew probed the wet part of the low field with steel rods, 8 feet long, on a grid. They hit soft mud, then softer mud, then more soft mud. They found nothing. The rods went in and came out and told them nothing at all, because 8 feet is a long probe for a man's arms and an absolutely meaningless distance for what was actually under that field. They dragged the wet part with a boat and grapples on the Friday and brought up a hubcap from a 1968 Rambler and a cattle bone. Then the water table came up, and the low field filled in with 3 feet of standing brown water. And that was the end of the low field as a search area. It became, on every map in the case file, a blue shape labeled pond. The mystery swallowed the county. It was in the Pittsburgh papers within a week. 14 people from one family vanished without a trace, from a farm at the end of a dead-end road. There were searches through the state game lands with 300 volunteers. There were divers in every strip pit and reservoir within 40 miles. There were psychics. There was an FBI liaison for 6 weeks. There was a theory about a cult, and a theory about a gas leak, and a theory about the family fleeing a debt, which their bank records flatly demolished. And there was one baffling clue that the entire investigation eventually hung itself on. On the Wednesday, 3 days in, Corporal Lisk sat in the Teal kitchen and interviewed a 17-year-old girl who had been the last outsider on that property. Margot Teal was terrified. She had not slept. Her hands would not stay still on the table. She had spent 72 hours understanding that she was important, that she had information, that whatever she said would matter enormously, and she had a horror, sitting there, of being useless. Lisk asked her what she saw driving out, and Margot said she thought she passed a truck coming up Pinch Road, a pickup, dark red, maybe maroon, with something in the bed, covered. She said, "I think." She said, "Maybe." Lisk wrote it down. 3 weeks later, it was in the newspaper without the "I think" and without the "maybe." There was a man in Kettner's Bend named Roy Prosser. He was 44. He hauled water for drilling rigs. He lived alone in a trailer on Route 9. He had a temper on him and 2 old DUIs. And he drove a maroon 1987 Dodge. Roy Prosser had an alibi. He was at his sister's in Latrobe that night, and 11 people saw him. Lisk cleared him inside of a week and said so, in writing twice. It did not matter even slightly. For 24 years, Roy Prosser was the man who did it. Kids dared each other to knock on his door. His truck got its windows put out 3 separate times. He lost the hauling contract in 1994. He was refused service at the Foodland by a cashier who wouldn't look at him. His sister stopped speaking to him in 2001 because her husband couldn't take the phone calls anymore. He went from 44 to 68 inside a story he had nothing to do with. And the man who kept that story alive, year after year, was Wendell Doyle. Wendell had missed the reunion because of a fight with his father. And there is no arithmetic in the world that lets a man carry that. So he did what people do. He converted it. He made his guilt into a job. He printed flyers. He called reporters on every anniversary. He sat in the parking lot of the Foodland with a folding chair and a poster board. He told anybody who would listen that a maroon truck went up that road, and the police let the man who drove it walk. He was not a villain. He was a man holding a hot coal with both hands, because putting it down would have meant admitting there was nothing to hold. The case quickly went cold. By November of 1992, it had 1 investigator. By 1995, it had none. 24 years passed. Walter and Eileen Doyle were declared legally dead in 1999, along with the other 12, in a single afternoon in a Vesey County courtroom that took 40 minutes. The farm went to the county for back taxes in 1997. In 2004, it was re-subdivided into 11 building lots and sold off. The barn came down in a windstorm in 2001. The butter yellow farmhouse was scraped in 2005, and a family named Ocampo built a 3-bedroom ranch on the same footprint, with a garage and a satellite dish and a basketball hoop over the driveway. The low field became a wide, shallow, grassy dish in somebody's back pasture. Water stood in the middle of it in the spring and dried by July. Deer bedded in it. It was, by 2016, one of 1,000 unremarkable swales in a county full of them. Nobody in the Ocampo family had any idea what it was. The realtor had mentioned an old pond site. That was true. Hazel's daughters died. Bonnie's parents died. The volunteer fire company held a memorial cookout every June for 8 years, and then it fell to 5. And then it was just Wendell and a card table. Roy Prosser got older in his trailer. Emmett Lisk retired in 2018 with a bad back and a box of files he was not supposed to have kept and had kept anyway. And Margot Teal Margot grew up. She married a man named Kurt Van Tassel and unmarried him 9 years later. She worked as a scheduler at a dialysis clinic in Uniontown, which is a job that consists entirely of counting. Chairs, hours, machines, people. She was good at it. She was known for it. Her whole professional life was making sure the number of people matched the number of places for them. She never had children. She kept a strawberry-shaped plastic barrette in the inside pocket of every purse she ever owned, moving it from one to the next for 24 years. And she never once told a living soul why. And every few months, for 24 years, she woke up at 3 in the morning with the same thought sitting on her chest, as clear and cold as a coin. I don't actually remember that truck. June 2016, the 24th anniversary. A young reporter from a regional paper, 26 years old and hungry, decided to do a piece on the Doyle case. She rented the fire hall for an evening and put a notice in the paper and expected maybe a dozen people. 60 came. Wendell Doyle spoke for 11 minutes. It was the speech he had been making since 1993, worn down smooth as a creek stone. He said the police had failed. He said a truck went up that road. He said everybody in this room knew whose truck it was. And then, from the fourth row, a 41-year-old woman with a clipboard straight posture and a scheduler's voice stood up and said, "No, I need to say something." The room turned. Margot Teal said, "I'm the one who told them about the truck, and I don't think I ever saw it." You could hear the folding chairs. She kept going, because she had been building this for 2 decades, and if she stopped, she would never start again. She said she had been 17. She said she had been asked what she saw, and she had been so frightened of having nothing that she gave the officer something. She said that in the 24 years since, she had gone back over that drive down Pinch Road 10,000 times. And every time she got to the truck, she found the same thing. Not a memory, but a picture flat. Always the same angle, no sound, no motion, no before, and no after. She said she was fairly sure the truck she was remembering was a truck she had seen at the county fair the week before. She said, "I made a man's life into a rumor because I was a scared kid who wanted to be helpful." Wendell Doyle stood up and screamed at her. He had to be walked out. Half the room went with him. It was, by every account, the worst night that fire hall ever had. But before it fell apart, Margot said one more thing, and it was the thing the reporter put at the very bottom of the article because it seemed like nothing. She said that if anybody actually wanted to know what she remembered, what she really remembered, what had never been in a newspaper because nobody ever asked, it was this: that the pond had drained itself in the middle of the week before the reunion, that the ground down there smelled like pennies and rotten eggs and cold cellars, that a paper plate slid on the porch floor, that the kitchen door wouldn't latch, that the ground made a booming noise twice that day, and that by 6 o'clock every bird in the valley had left. The article ran on June 30th, 2016, on page 7, under the headline, "Witness Recants in 1992 Doyle Case." 400 miles of nothing happened for 9 days. On July 9th, Margot Teal's phone rang while she was in the frozen aisle at the Giant Eagle. The woman on the other end said her name was Dr. Nadia Brun. She said she was a hazard geologist with the State Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation. She said she had read the article twice and then printed it out and then read it again. She said, "Ma'am, I don't care about the truck." She said, "I want you to tell me about the pond." Margot stood in the frozen aisle for 11 minutes. Dr. Nadia Brun was 48 years old, built like a fence post, and had spent 22 years driving to people's houses to explain why their kitchen floor was 3 inches lower than it used to be. Pennsylvania has more than 250,000 acres undermined by abandoned deep mines. When those old workings fail, the ground above them comes down. Sometimes it comes down slowly, over years, and you get a sag. Sometimes it comes down all at once, and you get a pit. Brune had spent her career reading a language nobody else on that side of the state could read. And when she read Margot Teal's list of nothings, she read a paragraph. She explained it to Margot in a Wendy's parking lot 2 days later, drawing on a napkin. "A pond that empties overnight," she said, "is not a pond with a leak. A pond that empties overnight is a pond that has found a hole in the bottom of the world. It means a void opened underneath, and the water went into it. The penny smell is iron. The rotten egg smell is sulfur. That is mine water. That is water that has been sitting in a flooded coal seam for 60 years. And if you can smell it in the open air, the seam is venting, which means there is now a path from the mine to the surface, where there was not one before. The cold air coming out of ground cracks in June is mine air. The sliding paper plate and the door that wouldn't latch are the same fact. The house was tilting. Slowly, over days. The booming is roof fall. Pillars and roof rock failing underground, hundreds of feet down. "And the bird's leaving," she said. "Is the bird's leaving?" Brune put down the pen and said, "Everything you noticed that day was a precursor. Every single one. That is a textbook sequence. That's the sequence we teach." Margot said, "A precursor to what?" And Nadia Bruna said, "To the ground opening." Margot's blood ran cold. Because she understood, sitting in a Wendy's parking lot at 41 years old, that she had spent 24 years apologizing for a memory that was false, while carrying 5 memories that were true, and that she had never told anyone the true ones, because nobody had ever asked her what the ground was doing. They had only ever asked her what the people were doing. She said, "There were 14 of them." Brune said, "I know." Margot said, "And 3 cars down in the low field." And Nadia Brune, who had been doing this for 22 years and had learned to be extremely careful with her words in front of families, was quiet for a long moment and then said the most careful sentence she could construct. She said, "Nobody ever searched underneath." Here is what stopped this in 1992 and what nearly stopped it again in 2016. Nobody had a crime. And without a crime, nobody had a warrant, a subpoena, a court order, or any legal right to put a single shovel into ground that belonged to somebody else. The Doyle case was officially an open missing persons investigation with no probable cause attached to any location on Earth. Emmett Lisk, retired, could not have gotten a judge to authorize a hole in the Ocampos' pasture if he had begged on his knees, and he came close to trying. But Nadia Brune did not need a crime. She needed a hazard. Under Pennsylvania's mine subsidence statutes, any citizen may file a subsidence hazard complaint on any property, and the Bureau has an affirmative obligation to investigate because the state's interest is not in what happened. It is in whether the ground is presently going to kill somebody. That obligation comes with survey access, right of entry for investigation, drilling authority, and, at the far end of it, condemnation power. It is a completely different door. And it had been standing unlocked for 24 years, and nobody ever tried the handle, because nobody had ever thought of the Doyle case as a geology problem. On July 22, 2016, Marguerite Teal of Uniontown, Pennsylvania, filed a citizen subsidence hazard complaint on parcel 14-006-114, Sable Township, Vesey County. It cost her nothing. It was 3 pages. She filled it out on a clinic desk on her lunch break, in a scheduler's handwriting, and she counted the boxes twice before she mailed it. The first thing Brune did was the cheapest thing. She went to the mine maps. The Sable No. 4 mine was operated by the Chester Line Coal Company from 1911 to 1957, and worked the Pittsburgh seam by room and pillar which means they cut a grid of tunnels and left square columns of coal standing to hold up the roof. When they abandoned it, they took what pillars they could on the way out, which is called robbing, and then they walked away and let it flood. The final maps were filed on microfilm in 1958. Brune pulled them in an afternoon. The Doyle farm sat over the northeast panel, directly under the low field. At a depth of roughly 230 feet, was a section where the pillar spacing changed wide rooms, thin pillars, and a hand annotation from a 1955 inspector reading water heavy panel abandoned. The old dairy pond had been dug in 1948, right on top of it. Brune said later that when she laid the mine map over the parcel map and saw where the pond was, she had to go stand outside for a minute. The second thing she did was the seismic catalog. She emailed a colleague at Trenner University and asked for anything recorded in Vesey County on June 27th or 28th, 1992. He wrote back in 90 minutes. Cobb Ridge, June 27th, 1992, 2352, 16 UTC M2.1. Cataloged. Probable quarry blast. 2352 UTC is 7:52 p.m. Eastern. The waveform was still on file. Brune had it reanalyzed by 2 independent seismologists, neither of whom was told what it might be. Both came back with the same reading, in nearly the same language. This was not a quarry blast. Blasts have a signature, a sharp, shallow, high-frequency onset. This event began with a low-frequency roll and had an implosive character. One of them wrote, in a 2-line email, "This looks like a roof collapse in a flooded working. It's a big one. Where is this?" Nobody in Sable Township had blasted anything on a Saturday evening. And a magnitude 2.1 in that country is a rattle in the windows, a shudder in a coffee cup, the kind of thing that 400 people feel and nobody reports. Because in coal country, the ground grumbles and you go back to your television. 400 people had felt the Doyle family die and gone back to their television. The third thing she did was the benchmark. There is a bronze survey disc set in a concrete post on the corner of what used to be the Doyle property, placed by a county survey crew in 1961. And its elevation has been in the record for 55 years. 1,148.6 feet. Brune's crew resurveyed it in August of 2016 with GPS. It read 1,139.4, 9.2 feet. The bronze disc that had marked the height of that corner of the world since Kennedy was president was now 9 feet closer to the center of the earth. And here is the moment the entire case turned over. And everything that had been sideways for 24 years stood up vertical. Every search for the Doyle family, every dive team, every game land sweep, every psychic, every flyer, every one of Wendell's 24 Junes in a folding chair, had been an attempt to answer the question, how far did they go? Nobody had ever asked, how deep? Nadia Brune stood in a pasture in August of 2016 with a GPS pole in her hand, looked at a number on a screen, and understood that they had not gone anywhere at all. They had gone down. Teresa Ocampo was 44. Her husband Danny drove a delivery route. They had 2 kids, Ruby, 15, and Mateo, 10. They had bought that lot in 2004 and built on it in 2005. And they had $109,000 left on the mortgage and no other assets in the world. On August 30th, 2016, a state geologist knocked on their door and told them that their back pasture was probably a mass grave, that the void beneath it was probably still open, and that she would like to drill. You have to sit with what that is. Teresa Ocampo had done nothing. Her children had learned to ride bikes in that yard. Her mother-in-law lived in the back bedroom. Nobody in that family had been alive in Pennsylvania in 1992. and a stranger with a state ID was standing on her porch, explaining that everything they owned was sitting on top of a hole full of dead people. She said no. She said no for 11 weeks. And this is the part of this story that has no villain in it then, anywhere, which is the part people find hardest to accept. Because Teresa Ocampo was right to say no. If the Bureau confirmed active subsidence under that parcel, the property became uninsurable, unsellable, and eventually condemnable. A confirmation would take their house. Not the state taking it out of malice, the state taking it because the ground was going to take it anyway. But the number on the buyout would be assessed value in a county where nothing appraises for anything. And the Ocampos would walk away from 12 years of payments with maybe 60 cents on the dollar and nowhere to go. Teresa Ocampo was not hiding anything. She was not covering anything up. She had no secret. She had a mortgage and 2 children and a mother-in-law on oxygen. And the truth was going to cost her everything she had. And she fought it exactly as hard as any decent person would. There was no monster in this story. There was only a woman standing in a doorway with nothing to hide and everything to lose. It went to a magistrate in November. Margot Teal drove down for the hearing and sat in the back. Wendell Doyle sat 3 rows up and would not look at her. Emmett Lisk, 61 years old now, came in his own clothes and sat by himself. Teresa Ocampo's attorney argued that the complaint was a pretext, that a private citizen with no interest in the property had used a public safety statute to get around the absence of a criminal warrant. He was, in a narrow technical sense, entirely correct. And he said so with real force. And Margot sat in the back row and felt the truth of it land on her. Nadia Brune testified for 2 hours. She put the mind map on the screen. She put the seismic waveform on the screen. She put the 1961 benchmark elevation and the 2016 benchmark elevation on the screen, one above the other. Then Judge Alma Reskind asked her a question that was not about the Doyles at all. She asked, "Doctor, if there had never been a missing family, if this were just a pasture, would you drill it?" And Brune said, "Your Honor, if this were just a pasture, I'd have drilled it in August and I wouldn't have needed a hearing. There are 2 children living 40 meters from the edge of that feature, and it is still moving." The order came down on November 21st, 2016. Investigation and drilling authorized. Recovery operations expressly excluded pending further order. Teresa Ocampo stood up in the back of that room and walked out and did not cry until she was in the parking lot. And Margot Teal followed her out and stood 10 feet away for a long time and finally said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And Teresa said, "Don't, just don't." They became eventually something like friends. But that was later, and it was hard, and it never once felt clean. Before they drilled, they flew it. The state had airborne LiDAR coverage of Vesey County from 2006 and again from 2015. Laser elevation data, accurate to a few centimeters, flown for entirely unrelated reasons. Brune's team differenced the 2 data sets. The result was a color image that everybody who saw it remembers. Against a field of neutral gray, 9 years of a landscape not moving, there was one shape. A rough oval, about 240 feet across, sitting in the Ocampo back pasture, glowing in the color that meant subsiding. Over 9 years, the center of that oval had dropped another 11 inches. The ground was still going down. Slowly, patiently, an inch a year, 24 years after it had gone down all at once. The void was still open. The collapse was not finished. They drilled in April of 2017. The drilling contractor was a man named Art Gano, who had been putting holes in western Pennsylvania for 31 years. He refused to set his rig on the swale. He set up 90 feet off the edge, on ground that had not moved since 1961, and drilled at an angle. The first hole went down through 11 feet of soil, then a long section of broken, mixed material, what a driller calls rubble and what a geologist calls a chimney. The rubble column left behind when a section of ground drops into a void beneath it and the roof rock falls in after it. At 38 feet, the drill returns came up with something that was not rock. Art Gano stopped the rig and got down off it and picked it out of the sample tray with 2 fingers. It was a piece of asphalt roofing shingle, green, about the size of a playing card, with the granules still on it. Nobody said anything for a while. They went down another 200 feet in that hole, and the second and the third, and this is what the ground gave up in order, catalogued by an intern with a clipboard who had to be sent to sit in the truck twice. At 44 feet, painted wood, white lead paint over yellow. At 51 feet, window glass and a coil of galvanized fence wire. At 58 feet, a fragment of glazed ceramic with part of a blue transferware pattern on it. At 63 feet, a strip of oilcloth about 4 inches long, flannel-backed, printed with little bunches of cherries. Faded, almost white on one side, perfect on the other. At 71 feet, a Kodak 35mm film canister, gray plastic with a black lid, crushed flat, empty. And at 94 feet, in the third hole, they put a camera down. The downhole camera is a small thing on a cable with its own light, and it sends back a wobbling, grainy, greenish picture on a monitor in the back of a van. 6 people crowded into that van on the afternoon of April 19, 2017. Nadia Brun, Art Gano, 2 techs, a state trooper, and Margot Teal, who had been allowed on site as the complainant and who had not slept in 4 days. The camera went down through rubble and rubble and rubble. At 102 feet, it entered open space. The picture went black at the edges and the light fell away into a room. And then, as the camera turned on its cable, something came into the frame at the bottom of the screen, flat, pale, angled, with a straight machined edge that did not belong to any rock in the world. Art Gano stopped the winch. Nadia Brune leaned forward and said, very quietly, "Bring it left." The tech brought it left. It was the tailgate of a pickup truck, white, filthy, folded at one corner, resting nose down in a heap of broken sandstone, 102 feet below a horse pasture in Sable Township. There was a bumper sticker on it. Most of it was gone. You could still read 3 letters. FIR. Walter Doyle's son Gil had a white Ford pickup with a Sable Township Fire Company sticker on the tailgate. It is in the 1992 case file. It is in the description that went out on the wire on June 29, 1992. To every police department in 4 states. Margot Teal made a sound in the back of that van that 2 of the people present have never been willing to describe. They had been looking for that truck for 24 years. It had never been more than 400 feet from the mailbox. There was no confession. There was no letter. There was no journal. No deathbed statement. No man in a prison jumpsuit finally telling the truth. What there was, instead, was Nadia Brun standing in a fire hall on a Tuesday night in June of 2017 in front of 90 people with a projector and a laser pointer, explaining exactly what happened to the Doyle family reconstructed entirely from rock, water, elevation, and a seismic squiggle recorded by a machine 41 miles away. It took her 11 minutes to explain 11 seconds. She said, the Sable number. 4 mine flooded after 1957. Water sat in that northeast panel for 35 years, Coal pillars standing in acid, mine waters soften. They spall. They slough away at the edges, a little every year. And the roof they hold up gets heavier as it takes on water. And there comes a day. She said, sometime in the third week of June 1992, a pillar line in that panel failed. The roof above it came down. That opened a void, and the void began to work its way upward through 200 feet of shale and sandstone. A process called stopping, where the roof falls, and then the new roof falls, and the rubble column climbs toward the surface like a bubble rising through mud. She said, on about Tuesday, June 23rd, the rising void intersected the bottom of the Doyle Pond. 2.5 million gallons of water went down the hole in about 6 hours. Junie Doyle told Margot the ducks had left because the water went down the hole. Junie Doyle was 6 years old, and she was exactly right. She said, for the next 4 days, the ground surface over that void sagged. The farmhouse tilted about 1.5 degrees, enough to slide a paper plate, enough to stop a screen door from latching. Mine gases vented through the cracks. Roof falls continued underground and were felt at the surface twice on Saturday as low booms. Barometric and infrasound changes drove the birds out of the valley by evening. She said, at 7:52 p.m. on Saturday, June 27, 1992, the last competent rock span over that void failed. An area of the low field, roughly 240 feet across, dropped as a single mass. Not a slow sink, not a swallowing, a drop. The floor of that valley fell somewhere between 60 and 90 feet in a matter of seconds, taking with it the flat ground by the old pond, the fire ring, the picnic table, 3 parked cars, and 14 people who had walked down there in the last of the light to watch a man build a fire. Then 200 feet of rock and soil came down on top of it. Then over the following hours, the void's remaining water and mud surged upward into the depression and filled the surface with the churned brown slurry that a state trooper named Emmett Lisk looked at on Monday morning and described in his notebook as low field flooded / slumped cattle damage. No usable ground. There was no scent trail past the mud because there was no past the mud. There was no crime scene because there was no crime. Brune said one more thing at the end, and she said it to the room, but she was looking at one person in the second row. She said, "It was fast. I want the family to hear that from me and not from the internet. Whatever your worst version of this has been for 24 years, this was faster than that. Most of them never knew the ground had moved." Wendell Doyle sat in the second row and put his hands over his face and did not take them down for a long time. What follows is not justice, because there is nobody to serve justice on. This is what happened instead. In September of 2017, the Vesey County coroner formally reclassified the 14 open missing persons files as accidental deaths. Cause listed as mine subsidence collapse. Date and time of death listed as June 27, 1992, 7:52 p.m. 14 death certificates were issued in one morning, 25 years late. The Doyle case, the oldest open file in that barracks, was closed by a geologist. There was no recovery. 3 separate engineering assessments said the same thing in slightly different words. The void is still active. The rubble column is unstable. Any attempt to excavate would require removing 200 feet of overburden across 5 acres, or would almost certainly trigger further collapse, and would put working crews in a hole that had already come down once without warning. One report put the risk of a fatal incident during recovery at better than 1 in 3. Nobody was going to die twice for this. In March of 2018, The state entered the parcel into the abandoned mine hazard program, condemned the Ocampo residents, and bought them out at appraised value plus relocation. It was not enough money. It never is. Teresa Ocampo signed the papers in a county office with her jaw set and her hands flat on the table. They moved 11 miles to a rental in Connellsville. Ruby finished high school there. Margot Teal drove Mateo to 2 of his baseball games that spring, which is the kind of small, awkward, insufficient thing that is sometimes all a person can offer. Then the legislature did something that had never been done in that state before. On petition from the families, and there were families, in-laws and cousins and Hazel's granddaughters, and one very old woman in Ohio who had been Bonnie's college roommate, the site was designated a statutory burial place. 5 acres of Sable Township, fenced, deed restricted in perpetuity, no excavation, no drilling, no construction, no disturbance of any kind. Ever. The ground that took them became the place they are buried. They put a marker at the fence line on June 27, 2018, 26 years to the day. It is not a large monument. It is a curved wall of local sandstone about waist high, and on it are 14 names in 2 rows. And under the names one line that the family argued about for 4 months and finally agreed on. They were not taken. They were not lost. They were here all along. Roy Prosser came. He was 69. He stood at the back with his hands in his jacket pockets and did not talk to anyone and left before the end. He never got an apology from the county or from the newspaper or from most of the people who had spent 24 years crossing the street. What he got was smaller and stranger. He went into the Foodland the following week, and the cashier said good morning to him, and he had to go sit in his truck for a while. Wendell Doyle went to see him in the fall of 2018. He sat in that trailer on Route 9 for 3 hours. Nobody knows what was said. Wendell told his cousin afterward only that Roy Prosser had made him a cup of coffee and had not once said the words, "I told you so," and that this had been much worse than being yelled at. Wendell died in 2021. He is buried in Kettner's Bend, 4 miles from his family, which is as close as the ground would allow. Emmett Lisk gave one interview after the reclassification, and he was asked whether he blamed himself for the 14 words in his notebook. He said, "I wrote down what I saw. That's the whole job. I saw a muddy field." Then he said, "The problem is, I saw it Monday. If anybody had been up that road Saturday night, they'd have seen a hole. By Monday, it was already just a field again. This county closes over things. That's what it does. It's what it's been doing since 1911. And Margot Teal. Margot has visited that fence line 4 or 5 times a year since 2018. She parks on the berm and walks up and reads 14 names she only ever knew as strangers, except for one. At the dedication, before the concrete set, she pressed a small plastic strawberry-shaped barrette into the base of the wall, just below the last name in the second row, and pushed it in with her thumb until it was flush. It is still there. You can see it if you know where to look. She had told a 6-year-old she would come back next Saturday. It took her 26 years, but she is not a person who leaves a count unbalanced. Here is the part of this that stays with people. For 24 years, everybody in Sable Township believed a man had driven a maroon pickup up Pinch Road and done something unspeakable to 14 people. That belief cost Roy Prosser his work, his family, and most of his life. It cost Wendell Doyle every good year he had left. It cost the county a quarter-century of pointing at the wrong thing. And when the truth finally came, it was harder to accept than the monster had been. Because a monster means somebody chose it. A monster can be hated, hunted, punished, and in some crooked way, understood. A monster means the universe was paying attention. What actually happened at the end of Pinch Road was that a company took the coal out of the ground in 1935, left a room with thin walls holding up a valley, walked away in 1957, and let the water in. 57 years later, on a warm Saturday evening, with a hay wagon hitched and a fire about to be lit, the arithmetic came due. Nobody meant it. Nobody wanted it. There was nothing to forgive, and nobody to forgive it. That is a much lonelier answer than a man in a truck. It is also, when you sit with it long enough, a gentler one. Because it means that on the last evening of their lives, that family was not afraid. Nobody was pleading. Nobody was hurting anybody. 14 people who loved each other walked down a slope together in the gold end of a June day to watch an old man light a fire, and the world was exactly what it appeared to be, right up until it wasn't. They didn't leave. They didn't run. Not one of them abandoned anybody. They were 40 feet from the mailbox the whole time. The truth about the people who vanish is that they are almost never nowhere. They are somewhere, precisely, in a place with an elevation and a set of coordinates, and the only thing standing between them and being found is whether anybody thought to look in the right direction. For 24 years, everyone looked out. The answer was down. And it took a 17-year-old girl's memory of a pond, carried in silence for half a lifetime, and finally spoken out loud in a rented fire hall to a room of people who did not want to hear it, to turn the whole world 90 degrees. In the end, nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been stolen. Nobody had been cruel. There was only the ground and the water and the weight of everything above, and a family who never went anywhere at all. They were here all along,